A white president made them free over 150 years ago, but he did not make them equal in the eyes of their communities. He made them unemployable, not because they couldn't work, but because he threw them into the midst of the other ethnic groups before them that stood in long lines of despair, because there were only so many jobs to be spared. Their worth was based on the freedom of their labor. A northern president took away their value. Now they are just part of the region's labor force. The freedom of the slaves initially hurt the landowners, but competition for the low-wage jobs reinvigorated the wealthy. All they had to do was exploit the dissimilarity in color, allowing the rich to thrive, while the poor colors fought it out for the jobs. And the rich didn't despair because they had plenty of poor to choose from. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of 4 children walking up a hill together signified equality. But it never inferred that the black children would walk first and the white children follow, because that is not equality, that is supremacy. The affirmative action law signed in 1964 was to make amends to the black community for years of persecution by allowing them a period of catch-up in rights. But 50 years later, it has created another persecuted ethnic group of Caucasian people, mainly white men, who are still second-class citizens. Blacks can have their own communities. Chinese can have Chinatown, Vietnamese Little Saigon, Japanese Little Tokyo. But let a white person want a community in their country of their own, and it is considered racist. Maybe the law, when it was enacted, was good. But that was then. This is now. Slavery was never the main issue at the beginning of our country, when the first blacks were brought to America. Free labor was the issue. So initially the Irish, British, and other ethnic groups descending on American shores made up the labor force. Indentured servants needing to pay off debts became white slaves when they were brought to America from the European continent to do their lord's bidding. Slavery knows no color. Unfortunately for the poor, these plantation owners are calling themselves lords, as if they have a direct line to the Almighty. But these impoverished workers, these slaves of all colors, are the ones that built the railroads, they built the bridges, and they harvested the crops, including cotton, that were given away or sold to the other rich. The leavings were given to them as pay or charity, whichever you want to express it. Plow the fields, pick the cotton, work for slave wages. Demand more pay for your work. That was the American dream. But the rich politicians, the wannabe feudal lords, the lords of their manors, their plantations did not want to discuss wages with their help. It would interfere in their way of life. These initial slaves, these whites, were flogged, were punished, their wives and daughters used for sports, and they had no right to complain. They also were put to death because no one talked back to the landowner. This was their whole means of livelihood. This was their job, but circumstances dictated that no more was going to happen to them. So slowly they stopped coming to work, or if they did, they worked in a slower manner. Eventually, the landowner understood that there were grievances growing, but the solution to the worker was simple: more money, less punishment, and more concern. That solution was not what the landowner had in mind, because his workforce needed to be controlled. They needed to be loyal, and they needed to accept punishment when it was dealt out. We have our place in our society, and these workers have their place. And the politicians in D.C. at the time lived so far from their homes to travel, and communications was worse, that even they didn't know what went on in another politician's backyard, or even if they cared. Slavery isn't just about room and board. It is also about the control of a full-fledged economy. Unfortunately for America, a young country, a revolution in the fields was brewing. Work stoppages becoming more severe, and the demands quietly suggested before have suddenly become the demands of the firm. We don't need your work. We can live off the land. But can you grow the crops without someone to harvest it? These landowners, though, were never concerned with the health of their families, their subsistence, or their continued long lives. They don't want to be paid. They don't have to work. The first boatload of slaves appeared. They were people of dark color. They wore scanty outfits that no decent European would accept. They wore jewelry, and their faces and hair were covered in clay of different colors. The English women looked down at these animals. The Indians that their husbands and sons had to fight looked better than them. But the chains they wore on their arms and legs was the only good to be surmised by the witnesses watching, women cringing at the idea of them remaining free. So chain them like dogs. These witnesses at this moment thought themselves still employable, that the landowners would soon cow down to their terms of employment, that these savages were nothing more than a performance to show them how much they themselves have that another person might not have. The draft beer, the ales, the whiskeys run rampant because the emotion of the moment was being spread across the barroom floor. The aristocrats no longer had workers that respected them. Unfortunately, the people employing these slaves rationalized their presence to make it appear wholesome and righteous, but failing to mention that they worked for free. They didn't consider that their enslavement was wrong, because they were giving them better living conditions than they had in Africa. No wild animals to kill them, and if they obey their masters, they will live a long life. The disenfranchised workers, though, looked at their opposition by their color and nothing more. This color, black, took their jobs. Their family doesn't have food, adequate shelter, while these people burnt by the sun cozy up with the landowner. There is no reason now why this landowner would change their minds about their pay, because they already have replacements. If these black people weren't here, they would have their jobs back. These enslaved workers had their food. They had shelter on the plantation that were never offered to them. What these discarded workers didn't see behind the scenes was the brutality, the inhumane living conditions within the sheds and barns on the properties. Hate literally existed in the woods at the end of the field where the townspeople lived. Bitterness was the legacy of the town's citizens towards the landowner, and this hate was cast onto the person of another color, because their loved ones had lost their means of living, died a broken soul. And these townspeople might live and survive the death of a loved one, but they won't let the black person forget who was the catalyst responsible for killing their kin. The people of the town watched the fields where at one time they were the harvesters, but they know that this new bunch of pickers took away the leverage for better wages and working conditions. It was told to them by these plantation owners and their like-minded cronies in every argument and discussion forever after why it was necessary to bring these black people to America. And that was because they could work better in the heat. But the townsfolk laughed in a sardonic manner, because they know that it was the wealth that was sacred to the rich and nothing more. The plantation owners no longer needed the townspeople. Their farms were self-sufficient. Blacksmiths worked with the slaves until they became proficient, and then they were let go. Trained veterinarians were still demanded, but the time between visits became extended. But though the jobs for white people stopped on the farms, there were other jobs that were produced. At one time, some blacks tried escaping, but this was not a jungle. Unfortunately for them, they never returned to the safety of the farm. But that was the town's secret. The landowners knew at that moment that the value of their free labor was in jeopardy unless the skilled employee was returned with minor damage. So this led to a reward system that paid good money for a black person's return. The plantation owners started feeling the resentment of the townsfolk, but they could ride through on their stallions or in their carriages, venturing to other plantations for social calls. They might meet at a weekly religious service at a church, but the congregation was restricted to the whites, and no one caused trouble in a house of worship. Eventually the blacks were baptized and converted away from their African ancestry to the teachings in the Bible. But this was more to control than to teach. Meanwhile, time has progressed where the rich people still bring slaves to America. But these slaves are called European white or Hispanic brown. And these new time slaves are paid, maybe not enough to maintain a life, but enough to share amongst each other and establish small communities, some on Main Street, while others remain in hiding. But segments of law enforcement have to take back seats to the truth when drugs are scattered liberally across our domain and gun violence flares, because no one wants to lose these virtually free employees that don't demand a contract to work. Give us back the South with the plantations on the hill, but place it in San Diego, Hollywood, and other cities of excess where gardeners are needed, nannies are needed, cooks and maids are needed. We will pay them for work performed, but if ever discovered, we will deny our understanding. They simply appeared and we hired them. Where groups of brown men enter your property during the early hours, speaking not a word of English, build a patio from scratch, and then disappear back into the dark, and you pay the contractor for work that eventually falls apart. The real problem, though, exists not for the white landowner needing a patio at what is thought to be a cut-rate price, but for the little brown man that soon finds that the employer has them working on other projects with the promise of payment forthcoming. But payday never arrives because the INS has made their claim first, and these workers are simply marched to the border and set free. These immigrants of illegal status are given the jobs of American workers, all colors, which include white and black, where the negotiations for livable wages have broken down, and the landowners, or wealthy, as they like to be called, have resorted to under-the-table barter with silent employees that can never speak up in grievance. These workers, though paid, are still slaves, but their control is not based on chains and abuse, but rather on fear for their families remaining intact. The fear that they can go to work one morning and don't come home, or someone they love is in the hospital, but they can't make their presence known because of fear of discovery. Respect for the law diminishes, but they cannot call authorities when they need them during a moment of violence, because even if what they are enduring is horrific, is what happens to them once the enforcement has begun. We lose people, we lose acquaintances, and we lose family in the desert that we have no time to bury because our journey takes us to a world where abundance thrives. So we bury our dead in our minds and memory, and then we cry in the middle of the night when we realize that our dead became nothing more than coyote food. We can't step forward to honor our dead, because discovery of our presence will only send us backward to a world we wish to forget. The two-legged coyotes, though, that brought us here are not our champions, because they pushed and pushed until we could not walk anymore, and then they pushed us even harder. They made their money off of human slaves, as well as the drugs they carried, and once they delivered the human bodies of living people to their new owners, they will return from whence they came for another batch of God-forsaken human beings. Thank you, San Diego, for the lack of security on the California border. Thank you, Mayor Wilson, for the prosperity we brought to your agricultural windfall, coupled with the economic growth and manufacturing legacy brought to your city. Thank you, SeaWorld and Legoland, for the jobs building your trademarks, your eventual success is guaranteed, and thank you, INS, for not simply shooting us in the streets. But why, Governor Wilson, would you deny our rights to citizenship after making your leadership in San Diego appear so astounding? Wasn't the low wages we were paid a cornerstone of your financial benevolence? If we were not slaves to you and your kind, then why did we have to hide in your shadow? 11 million people having to live in hiding in the most prosperous country in the world view San Diego, California as hell incarnate on earth. When they breached the border, they held their breaths until they were on the outskirts of the city heading north.